Hidden Path Entertainment is hiring to develop a AAA third-person open-world fantasy RPG that takes place inside the Dungeons & Dragons universe. Here are some of their games that they have created in the past: Raccoon Lagoon, Brass Tactics, Witchblood, Access Code, Hypercade, Defense Grid 2. They apparently did the Age of Empires 2 HD edition, so they've done some work with Microsoft, I guess. And they also created this little, I think, niche title named Counter-Strike Go.
I'm sure most people have heard of that. Good stuff. We went more than a decade with extremely few D&D titles, and basically absolutely zero, except for one terrible MMO, actual like multiplayer D&D games, which is shocking and horrifying considering that you know, D&D is a party-based group game that most people in the gaming world are familiar with. And for over a decade, there was basically nothing. Despite the fact that Neverwinter Nights, the original one, was one of the first community-supported persistent online worlds built into MMOs, and they did it really coolly. So the game couldn't support more than like 64 people on it at a time. There was some people who found out how to make it to almost double that, to a little over 100. And then they would stitch these servers together so that you would leave one server and it would transfer all of your most recent character data over to the other server for a different region. So main cities were quite full almost all the time, but then out in the rural areas and the exploration areas and some of the dungeon areas, there was like 20, 30, 40 people on those at a time. And because of the way that the PvP system worked, you would have a lot, in a lot of cases, you'd have to role play your PvP because there wasn't actual PvP allowed. Because of a lot of limitations that they had. And so you had to like honor play, you know, roles and shit. And it was amazing to take part in that, to see that. And then it was equally as shocking and amazing when a bunch of idiots decided that that's the most D&D games that the world needs right now. We don't actually need the ability to sit down and play a D&D dungeon with a game master with your friends online. Like that's just stupid. Why would we want to encourage anything close to that? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because it's absolutely ludicrous. Nobody wants that kind of a gaming experience. Are you joking? Like, what's wrong with you? And again, it's like I'm just, even to this day, I'm still flabbergasted that it took so long for them to actually start developing this kind of tech. And I think they didn't even do it until Pathfinder came along. You know, Pathfinder is a type of D&D experience. It's a different company. They follow more of the rules of 3.5 instead of 5e. And it wasn't until they started pumping out their game and it got super popular and people were starting to shift over to that in mass, because that was the only game they could play. There was even, like, you know, early in the days of like game apps on the phone, there were a ton of like people who were pitching ideas and pitching like, you know, oh, here, we made this game that you basically could play a dungeon with your friends on the phone. And those games, a lot of those projects were shut down super hard by certain company who has controlling interest in the IP and was like, yeah, this needs to be destroyed. You need to be, perhaps have lawyers show up and give you cease and desists and all this kind of stuff. And again, we just circled the drain of like nothing good coming out. Then Wizards of the Coast eventually got around to making their own app. They kind of featured some stuff, and the minute that they started being asked, like, people were like, hey, can we split this up so that I can bring a team of people in, maybe introduce, immediately shut down everything to do with it. And then they buried the project. And it's like, again, it's just, I'm sitting here looking at this going, you know, it wasn't until this again, Pathfinder basically opened up this possibility that's when they started working with these, you know, working with Larian Studios, working with these other companies, allowing them to start making these games. And now it looks like they're going full in, because this is like one of like 5 major D&D projects that are up and coming. Like,
oh, I didn't realize there were that many.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
no, it literally has exploded in the. Sorry, what'd you say?
No, there's like so many different versions of like this kind of adventuring group type dynamic through like lots of different other themes, like not just D&D, but like other takes on it. Mm-hmm. Like I saw a theme with like unicorns or with like crystals or something, and it's like they're trying, like now there seems to be like more of a movement of people being like, we're not content with what's out, we want to put out our own thing.
Yeah.
Well, there was probably a hunger for it, since Wizards of the Coast wasn't doing much with it on the video game front. And why they wouldn't? Yeah, that's very confusing.
It is extremely bizarre why they even when one of the moments that you might be able to say that kind of shifted D&D back into the mainstream was Stranger Things. Like, Stranger Things started with a D&D game, and it started with it in the show, and obviously, but the creators were huge D&D fans. But even before then, it was growing in popularity. It was really starting to like get bigger and bigger and bigger, and gaming cafes and whatnot. We've there's a ton of those around, and they started to like host more and more and more stuff. And again, you saw this hunger, and people kept asking and asking and asking and asking, and these big corporate types were just like, nah. Then suddenly it's like, oh, look at Pathfinder. Oh, they're making lots of... Okay, guys, we got to get as many people in making new games as possible.
I wonder if they thought that transforming it into a video game experience would take away from sales or interest in the tabletop game, which, I mean, I really don't see why it would, because it's a completely different kind of experience. But that's the only logical reason I can think of, is that they thought they'd lose money on the tabletop experience.
There's that, and there's also, like, you know, sometimes when you meet somebody and they're doing a cool thing, and you're like, wow, that's such a cool thing you're doing. That's so cool. I really enjoy watching you do the thing. Or some people might have a reaction saying, oh, that's such a neat thing. I also want to do the thing you're doing. Mm-hmm. Or we'll have another group of people even who's like, oh, I like that thing you're doing. I'm going to keep it all for myself. Nobody else should have this but me. I should reap all the benefits from this. Like, there's so many different attitudes that people can approach this with. And it's unfortunate to see that's, like, there's more of the latter that's being presented right now.
Well, in the early, late 90s and early 2000s, there was a push to really, like, expand out the D&D universe. And I forget the exact years that this took place because it's been so long. But there was a time where they were, like, really, like, starting to embrace the added interest that they were bringing. A lot of young people wanted to bring their ideas and their stories, and for a very short period of time, they were interested in working with this. Then suddenly they clammed up like crazy, turned their backs on basically everything, and I've talked with some voice actors and actresses who experienced this. They were keyed up to do dozens and dozens of projects attached to the D&D universe, and there was going to be all this stuff, and it was mostly going to be like second or third party. And then overnight, all of them got crushed. Like, everything got crushed. Everything was canceled, and there was just this. They just. Essentially, D&D and Wizards of the Coast basically just disappeared off the technical digital world map almost completely, and didn't show their face again until just recently. and now, you know, just a few years ago when they started making these deals. And again, it's like there were a handful of games that were made between that time, but most of them were just like, I remember one. It was a horrendous garbage action game. And I'm like, why would anybody make this and think this was D&D? There were some god-awful terrible movies done too. There was a really terrible D&D movie that was put out too. And a lot of this stuff, it just ignored the experience of what the tabletop was and followed a more like a Hollywood idealized version of, like, you know, fantasy, you know, combat kind of thing, where it's just really kind of quick and fighty and swords flashing and that kind of stuff. So again, I understand. I get it. I totally understand the desire to have different things done in different ways, I guess. But here, I don't understand why Wizards of the Coast basically vanished off the face of the planet. Because again, it wasn't that they didn't have, you know, top studios saying, "Hey, we'd like to work with your IP." They had people lining up around the block to do that. Always. Like, they never stopped having people knock on their door and say, "Hey, we'd like to work with the IP." Really big, really good companies. But for some reason, Wizards just said, no, we're not interested, and just kept on shutting the door in these people's faces. And again, you wonder why. You wonder why anytime anybody leaves something on the table, you know, especially when they weren't necessarily the original creators, they're just like people responsible for, like, you know, bringing it forward, and they're not interested in bringing it forward. They're just interested in just sitting there. So really weird and bizarre.
I suppose it's possible that they were working on something behind the scenes and then realized, oh, we can't do this ourselves, and then opened it up for other studios. I suppose that's one possibility, but just don't know anything for sure on that front.